Thank you for joining us today. Hi, Ashish, Abhimanyu, Harish. See, the conversation today is about skilling and whether how do we ensure that the country is more employed or employable. Uh, for much of the thing, I keep thinking, like, look at the formal education. A student passes through 156 examinations on a curriculum set by the state, a test set by the state, an assessment marks set by the state. And then at the end of it, all we come back is to say you're unemployable. And the problem starts from there of where did we fail as a country that the formal education which passed the student at every single level would have stopped him if he had failed the examination and then still turn out and have the gall to say that you are no longer employable, though you passed every single examination on a curriculum set by me, on a test set by me, on an assessment metric that is set by me. So for me, that becomes a larger thing. And then we come up with this NEP, which essentially talks of how we should skill the nation. Go back 30 years, in my heydays, to get into a polytechnic was a difficult thing. ITIs were there, which are all about skilling. Polytechnics were all there about skilling. Somewhere we moved on from there and we created BTech, which is a glorified institution for me. Some of the BTech engineering colleges are a shade better or possibly equivalent to what our earlier day polytechnics were. And then we now come to a stage which says that for a children to be employable or employed, we need skilling on top of everything that we've done. So my larger conversation at this point in time would be, to start off with each of you and try to first get your points of view of where do you think we failed to start with, and what is it that we need to do to correct the situation back to where possibly a student, when he's passing out and is finishing his education, actually becomes employable. So can we start with you, Abhimanyu, with your words?
Yeah. So I will go back to what you said, that the curriculum is set by the state. The exams are conducted by the state. Students pass them, and then we tell that they are unemployable. I think there's one interesting thing that today in the post-liberalization, open economy, capitalistic world, the fact is, however, employment is given by the industry. And industry is not which is involved in setting the curriculum or taking the exam, but then, and of course, then suddenly there's a handover from the state to the industry, and the industry says that these people are unemployable. I think the root, what has caused is that the diversion between collaboration of industry and the education system to design the curriculum, to train, so to make sure that the transition from academia to industry is not through a big gap, but it's very kind of integrated. I think that is, in my opinion, that is where the gap is. Harish, maybe if there's something that you would like to add.
Totally agree with that, Abhimanyu. So two things I'll just add to that. One, as you rightly pointed out, there is this divergence between the industry and what collegiate or formal education does, right? So formal education quite often doesn't keep up with a lot of what's happening in the industry, right? I mean, we deal with this every day, right? So we have to get people employable, get them into jobs. Some of the jobs that people are trying to get into today didn't exist 18 months ago, right? And these are brand new jobs, and by the time colleges adopt this, that's 5 years down the road, right? So that's one big problem. And the second big problem also is it's a people problem, right? Because if you look at a lot of educators in the formal collegiate or even pre-collegiate level, they themselves may not be familiar with a lot of this. A lot of people who are familiar with this are not involved in that education system, right? So if you look at what would constitute a really well-functioning ecosystem, it would be industry participants as mentors, right? It would be industry and companies training educators and in imparting a lot of that education, and then working with them in designing the right kind of structure, curriculum, labs, so on and so forth, right? And so it can't be that they're just the consumers and not part of the production system, right?
Sahil?
I'll add, So I'm fairly anti-system as a person, so I believe I disagree with a bit. I think it's a government problem. So the modern day license Raj still exists in education, which is why you see supply. So supply demand problem, it's a classical supply demand problem, which is created by the government. So the moment so let's imagine a world in which computer science does not exist or mechanical engineering does not exist. It's the software guys. The stream will continue to exist. We produce the most amount of mechanical engineers ever in the world, right? I think that is also even by a factor of 5x. And our automobile industry is nowhere. We are 4% of the global automobile industry, but I think 4x the mechanical engineers. Where do you put them? But it is the government law which says, no, 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 when you set up a university, you need certain mechanical engineers, certain civil engineers, and this is what regulation does to you. This is exactly like if you were starting in 1971, I told you, oh, you have to manufacture scooters, so rubber yahan se aayega, and something like that. It just doesn't work. When you get government into it, it's more like Russians deciding ki how much bread will be made by whom. It just doesn't work. The system has to be the earlier polytechnics linked to the industry. I don't know how, but the government has to get out of it. The degree system, yes, we need decent amount of mechanical engineers, but not a lot of mechanical engineers. The rest of them should be into modern day jobs. What if we had a lot of, let's say we have new jobs in AI, but the right answer is not create a BTech in AI. The right answer is that let's stop recruiting and some of the batches new should be trained by Great Learning on Scalar and they are placed directly in the industry. The cost involved in just training these people from mechanical engineering takes a toll on the economy in itself. That is a bigger problem. So if the state resources was just given to these guys or the providers in general and let the capitalism take care of itself. The moment you mess up with capitalism by just deciding state controls, you go very deep in a problem.
Abhimanyu, would you want to add something to that? Because he's now moving towards capitalism in a sense, right? I have a point of view on that, which is very, very strong. So I'll come back on that later. But how do you, first of all, say that possibly skilling companies should replace formal education? Because Sahil is advocating that at some level you need to remove the government intervention and the BTech part of it.
No, while I agree with some part, but of course there's a layer to it that I would like to add as well, that capitalism definitely solves many problems, but there are domains where there is a certain control is also needed. Particularly, I think medical and education being two. US medical system, I think, is one example where pure capitalism in some of the domains doesn't work as well. Right? That being said, however, I think the way to ensure that a pure capitalistic system doesn't grow in negative ways towards the welfare of the country is that, like your example of that, a central government body deciding how many mechanical seats should be there in college is definitely very inefficient. There should be, government should be more involved instead of having the license Raj, having a close scrutiny about the institute's real performance, that what is the kind of employment that an institute is able to deliver, right? So for example, instead of enforcing that there are so many seats and there are so many square footage of area that an institute should have, if they rather enforce that this is the kind of employment outcome, this is the kind of placement that an institute must drive, and if you are not able to drive, then probably you have to reduce seats. Or you might need to shut it down if you are just taking fees from people and you are not leading employment. Those kind of outcome-linked control by the government on education, or even let's say decides your fees as well, that your average placement and fees must maintain this certain ratio. Those kind of control will push industry to deliver better. So instead of, I think, control in the sense of inputs, that you should have these many square feet of land ownership, or these many PhD holders in the payroll, or you can only allow these many seats, the ways of control need to shift. So that's my submission to that.
Harish, just to, I don't want this to ultimately go towards socialism versus capitalism, so I'm trying to pull back from that. See, one of the things that you and Abhimanyu talked of is there's not enough industry participation in setting the curriculum, because of which this problem comes up, right? Now, that's a very small problem to solve, because now you have practicing professors in institutions, right? Essentially, these are people who are professionals who joined the academia and are working within the institutions, and you can mandate that at least 10% of your professors should be practicing professors. So that solves the academy-industry collaboration part of it. So do you think if we were to intervene at that level and say you need to have industry setting the curriculum along with you and not just you setting the curriculum, wouldn't that solve the problem and take you away from this entire debate?
I don't think it takes us away entirely. I think it helps solve the problem. So a lot of what's happening with NEP, in principle at least, is very good. Right? These are very good things. We're talking about professors in practice, fantastic. We're talking about the ability to take, some flexibility in coursework, take it online, take it, with, other companies, upskilling providers, other universities, transfer credits, academic bank of credits, all of that is fantastic. What's also great is the multiple exit options and all of these. But the devil is in the details, right? Now, this all works if the whole ecosystem works exactly as intended, right? And what do I mean by the ecosystem? Again, I mean companies that are absorbing, a lot of this talent, participating in the whole process, in the design process. It is people who are actually working, participating in the instructional process. And it is, to some extent, decentralizing this whole thing to allow people to do it the way they need to do it, right? So we were talking about, different cities and different ecosystems. Now, Chennai has a very different ecosystem than Bangalore, right? So we see this every day because we have multiple centers, multiple locations. People graduating in Chennai have a different profile of kind of companies they will go to, right? So what they need to be trained on is largely dictated by that ecosystem of industry there, right? Which is different from Bangalore, which is different from elsewhere. And it's great to allow that ecosystem to develop, right? Now, what we don't, and this is something, Abhimanyu, you can probably speak to this as well, but we do this every day, right? A large part of our instructional workforce are industry folks, right? Why are they industry folks? Because they're the most up to date. They're able to give kind of real-time information and train people. So it is, I think the large brushstrokes are there, but it has to be implemented properly. And the crux, of all of this is people, right? If you don't have the right people in place, then it doesn't really work.
I think that's a very good end point, which is good people and bad people, what you said, Harish. And I'll come to that with you, Sahil. Removing this thing of public education versus private education, are we too harsh in judging public education and putting them under a microscope for everything wrong they do? While the fact is that even on the private education space, you actually have people fleecing and profiteering and whatnot. So it is about people. It's about the kind of people who run the institutions. Like even today, the most sought after institutions in the country are the public institutions, right? So do you think this is to do with the kind of people who are getting the space? And if you were to just open it up, you will actually have a set of people being, wrongly victimized for no fault of theirs.
So while it is true that a lot of our top institutions are public and not private, but at the other level, education is non-profit as well. And it is, if you look at the large structure, it is all linked, right? Yes, some private sector guys come and they fleece people and they do not deliver quality. And this is majority of engineering colleges or even medical colleges and a lot of arts colleges you can think of. But with the right regulations, so the regulation should always be optimum. The more regulation kills the industry, and too less regulation becomes like crypto when there is just like anything happening. The right example is something like a SEBI kind of a body which is not defining how do you do an IPO, somewhat lesser regulation, where if you have really bad outcomes like he said, then you are supposed to shut the institution or take drastic measures. That should actually be implemented by the regulator. So, that's what I believe. That it is, both of them, there are a lot of public institutions as well in the country which do not deliver outcomes as well as private ones. But the right answer is a balanced regulator, and that will deliver the outcomes.
Well, but in the edtech space, especially on the skilling space, there's no regulator. It's not that everything is hunky-dory out there,
but
isn't it?
they have to take money, but they're not subsidized by the government. Most of them, and and it is you as a client choose them. So if let's say over some years, some edtech does not provide employability, which is in the skilling space, that will go through a negative cycle on online reviews and their enrollments go down. And this is what we've seen. And with others also during a bottom IT cycle, when the recruitments are lower, people experience lesser enrollments. So this is actually the job cycle and industry working together, or this is the capitalism way of telling this is how balance has to be achieved. So I think this is working perfectly well. The bad skilling guys will go out of the system, the good skilling guys will double up, and this is how the system will go.
So Abhimanyu, see, because Sahil talked of subsidization, there is another misnomer that keeps coming back saying that certain things are subsidized and because of which you need to hit back at that. I think more than subsidized, license Raj is a fair way that some people get a license to give a degree and it may not deliver the outcome, but they'll get a degree, which is a paper degree, which we call degree mills in that sense, right? The question is that the outcome kind of a thing, private players struggle to deliver at times and public players also struggle to deliver at times. How is it on the doorstep of the public institutions to do everything because if you look at the higher education space at this point in time, 82% students still go through the private education space. The institution the degree might be public institution, but the college is the private college. So how is it the responsibility of public institution to correct this entire structure?
No, so I think, of course, it's very nuanced. It's not as simple as it looks at the surface. I'll come to public and private one by one. Now, on public institutions, my way to measure, like if I need to measure efficiency of an educational system, I would look at input, that what is the total fee collected by the public institution, which might be small, and what is the total annual grant given to the government by them. Divide that by total number of students they are serving. That is the real cost per student that they are spending. Compare that with the outcome they are able to produce, right? Now, interestingly, now if I quote some numbers, if I talk about IITs, which are the most premium institutes, and they of course have done fantastic work in multiple ways, but interestingly, the actual cost per student at an IIT for a year is about 40 to 50 lakhs, if I include the subsidy given to them, right? That's right. If I add total fee collected plus all the subsidy given to them, divide that by the number of students they have in a year, that's almost 40 lakhs. Now, that is the fee paid to them. That might not be directly paid by the student, but that's paid by the taxpayer indirectly. Now, if I ask that for that cost, what is the kind of real educational delta that could be created? I will hold them accountable there. Coming to the private sector, right? Now, interestingly, in India, this is a policy evolution that I believe we need to go through. That, as you mentioned, that even in the private sector, it is non-profit. Higher education, particularly non-medical higher education, is not allowed to be for profit. I think that is a restriction. If there is for-profit higher education allowed, it would, one, allow for a lot of FDI into higher education, which in a way foreign capital to kind of build foundation of Indian education system, right? And I don't see anything wrong if there is a very efficient system which in open market dynamics attracts a lot of people coming into them. My experience, at least 10 years into higher education, have been that education is something where particularly in a developing and poor country like India, only the real career outcome is what attracts students. The fact is that people go to line up to get into an IIT and IIM because they have been able to produce great career outcomes. That's the only reason, right? You remove the placement from these institutes, there will be very few lining up on their doors. In private cycle, while through, let's say, a lot of marketing, sales, etc., some institutes might drive some education for some time, but you zoom out on a horizon of 5, 10 years, only those will survive which can deliver higher quality of education and higher quality of placements and career outcomes. What I believe is that if we do allow some form of for-profit higher education, attracting FDI, put strict regulations on the quality of outcome they must deliver, right? That might add a massive amount of value to the real outcome for the society.
So I totally agree with him. You said that the quality of outcomes is also decided limited by the quality of entrepreneur going into education, right? If you don't have for profit, does not mean promoters will not make money. They'll find their ways to make money. If you have tax rates of 90%, does not mean people do not make money. They make money in different ways. But just having investment, making it for profit will make higher quality people come into the education, and that will genuinely deliver better outcomes if regulated well. You'll have lesser of politicians. If a politician generally wants to deliver very high quality outcome and he can deliver, he should be setting up an institution and
No,
not.
I get your point. So I'm trying to.
No, I'm saying because most of the higher education institutes, right, the private ones have some political affiliation if you look at the broad structure. So it is not that divorced from the actual outcome. Having dealt with a lot of institutions, so I know the kind of and the quality of entrepreneurs, of late I've seen some of them, but the best quality of entrepreneurs don't want to get into it. The best of funds don't want to get into it. If you have a great university from abroad, that university does not want to get into it because it is not for profit and you don't have the higher quality entrepreneurs getting into it.
I'll just add one point to that. I think when we talk about skill development as a country, I think we have to separate what are things that are quote unquote high demand areas, right? Where I think the kinds of things that we usually operate in, and I think it's perfectly fine for us to be largely private sector driven for those, right? There is a market for it. There's no need to kind of curtail that, right? But there are a set of skills and a set of areas where public education does play a massive role. Right? Research institutions are a great example. Right? It's very hard for a private sector organization to justify plowing a lot of money into research, right? Fundamentally, and that's why TIFR exists. That's why a lot of research organizations exist. So research organizations, things where we're looking kind of longer term, right? If you look at, and I hate using Singapore as an example because it's a really small, rich country, but we can learn some things from them, right? So some of the things, for example, their MHRD does is actually focus on, okay, where do we want to be 10 years from now? What is private sector not investing in right now? And bridge that gap. And I think those are the kinds of areas where public sector education actually plays a massive role. So I wouldn't completely discount it, but I think that's where a majority of the focus, I believe, should be to balance out what I think is the market's working well as far as, computing and AI and some of the more job-centric, immediate job-centric areas.
So I'll just, I want to get away from this public versus private because it creates, there's strong opinions. I have a very strong opinion on the opposite side. I would keep it to myself at this point in time. As far as skilling is concerned, see, the idea now is how do we talk of demographic dividend. We talk of our population constructively participating in the growth of the country. And that's when the dividend accrues actually, right? How do you, and you have a formal education structure, and right now the private players like yourself are creating a layer to make these people employable because everyone now acknowledges that most of these people who went through the formal education structure are possibly unemployable, or most of them are unemployable, right? What is your, if I were to ask you, what are the two things that you will do to make this population employable? What would you suggest at a policy level?
No, I think first is that like our formal education system, the traditional engineering colleges. So if I break them into 3 layers, ITI, Polytechnic, engineering colleges, right? I think there is, we talked about, let's say if we put 10% of industry professionals to go and teach, will it fix it? My opinion is not 10, it should be 90%. 10% will not fix it. 90% may, right? First is I think I will give lot more freedom at the policy level to the institutes. So one is freedom and responsibility. Both have to be pushed together at the policy level to the formal education institutes. Give them freedom that you can hire whoever you want to, even if the person doesn't have a PhD or MTech or whatever degree. But then I will hold you accountable for, instead of holding you accountable for how many PhDs you have on your payroll, I will hold you accountable for the real outcomes.
So outcomes is one thing that you would want to...
change the policy to hold the educational institutes responsible for the real outcome. And second is then give them a lot more freedom. Instead of, let's say, enforcing that you must have only a 1:30 class ratio. Today we live in a world where this hall probably can sit few hundred people and still they can interact with us easily. So maybe leave it a little more open in terms of what the student to, what the class size needs to be, what kind of teacher should be teaching them, how much built-up area I might have. As much I have
I get
interacted
that.
with
Yeah.
folks, I think these restrictions stops them from delivering what they need.
I'll add something to it, and it has worked very well in globally. So our skilling system, so government spends fair bit of taxpayer money in skilling people. There are a lot of skill-based institutions, NSDC and everything else. I know a lot of them from my personal experience who are just shell companies made to extract money from the government. If the government actually was very serious around skilling, they should actually design output-based subsidies rather than input-based subsidies. Not decided by what goes in, how many people you can train and everything else. But let's say if he is eligible for a subsidy and he's, let's say, training 1,000 people, if let's say 900 people get jobs, he's given subsidy for those people. This and open up completely, like the way he's saying. This will only target. So if I launch a skill-based institution and I genuinely want people to be employed, I will employ people from the industry, because not employing people from the industry to deliver trainings will not get my kids placed. So outcome-based subsidies rather than input-based subsidies is something the right way to go from a policy standpoint.
Harish, a couple of questions as a follow-up for that. One is, see, NEP gives you quite a bit of freedom to, intervene with skilling programs as a part of the formal, structure, right? So you actually have about 85%, 90% people who are private education players in the formal education structure also. And they now have the freedom to intervene in terms of creating skilling programs as a part of the structure, because about 50% can be outside the curriculum, online, and there are many things that have been created, right? So do you think an intervention at that level because of NEP will solve the skilling problems where our graduates are unemployable, because you're actually including skilling as a part of this entire structure?
Again, I think it comes down to how it's done. So I agree that a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of in the letter of the law, the letter of the policy, I agree with it, right? So including skilling courses, including external courses, all of that makes sense, right? Now the question is, how is that actually done, right? If it's just a box checked, I don't think it really works. To add to what Abhimanyu was saying earlier, I think definitely increasing the proportion of industry participation, even in skilling courses, in the development of skilling courses and so on and so forth, makes a massive difference. Now, there are many ways to do it. One way could just be to incentivize them to do it. It could be, incentivizing universities to partner with industry, if that becomes one of the, your ranking criteria or something like that. But definitely making sure that link is tighter, because right now even the courses that you can take, what you're allowed to take and all of that is still very archaic. It's still very old world in that sense, right? So I think that's one big difference. The second thing is that generally, as far as things like overall structure, curriculum, what courses should be taught, what level of detail you need to go into, while the policy can provide guardrails, I don't think it needs to be given in as much detail. In fact, I don't think it should be given in as much detail, because I think, again, providing that level of micromanagement doesn't help, right? For that curriculum, for example, to get updated takes 5 years, 10 years, whereas we're talking about months in which, of review cycles and so on and so forth. So it's, ideally, it should be, set up a somewhat decentralized way of making these decisions. Stick to the guardrails, how many credits you need to have, how many hours of learning, how much industry participation you should have and all of that, but largely then let them run. And if at all possible, incentivize industry folks to come in, right? Incentivize, folks in this room to go and teach, create a course, whatever else it is, then that helps.
So I'll just respond to that. Practicing process is essentially that. And Sahil, jo aapne bola tha na, where you ask for incentives based on job, there is a massive scam that's happening all over the country on that. So because what happens is that they create company, they employ them, and then they collect the incentive. So see, people find loopholes in the legal system to deal with it, and that's people. It's not the system that's wrong. The people are people find ways. Abhimanyu, I'll just come to you on this whole thing. is there any country as populous, and I'm now referring to China, is there any good practice or policy that worked in any other country that we should adapt or adopt for India to make that big shift?
No, I think China particularly has very interesting examples, and some of the studies, in last 1 year I visited a couple of universities in China to study that, what's happening there. And it's very parallel as well because both culturally and in the size of the country and the dynamics, India and China do have a lot of parallels. And in many ways, I see that China is at least 10 years ahead so many things have played out in China already, which will play out in India in next few years. Recently, over last 5-7 years, one new thing that China did introduce is they have created a bunch of public and private, both higher education centers, which are very skill first. They ran massive pan-nation campaigns to make these very attractive. So now coming to, we had ITIs and we have polytechnics in India. Unfortunately, both on the public perception side, they became something of a second or third choice. They were not seen as something that most smart and most hardworking and most aspirational people go to. At first level, I think on the public perception side, that has to be fixed. Learning something that you can go and directly apply in the industry and grow faster in career is something that should be very aspirational rather than a second and third choice. So Chinese government invested massively on that. For example, they wanted to reduce dependency on Taiwan for the semiconductors. So they wanted to create a lot of talent domestically, which can build semiconductor systems. They got top professors from Tsinghua University, Zhejiang University, which are the top 3-4 universities in China. And they put them into these skilling universities. And they ran pan-nation awareness campaigns that these are the right institutes to go and join if you are someone intelligent and hardworking. I think something similar India should try to drive. I do believe that what we created at Polytechnic, which failed both because of poor execution and lack of consumer or learner attraction to it. I think building something similar again, which China has done over the last 5-7 years, and it has resulted in extremely high quality of talent coming out. I have worked, and my partner has worked with few people who came out of it, and the quality of talent these institutes have produced is fantastic. So I think that is one which I do feel India could replicate.
So Harish, taking off from what Abhimanyu said, he obviously wants us to follow China, right? What is your take on following China and everything that they've done?
Well, clearly everything doesn't work, but I don't know if that's what Abhimanyu was saying. No, I definitely agree with his point about removing the stigma around vocation and skill building, right? We tend to separate education from skill building. And skill building and vocational training is seen as last resort. We definitely have to get away from that. I think that pretty much any model you want to follow has probably done that. But in addition to China, I think that there are some smaller. So first of all, I think India has it's very hard for us to look at one. I mean, typically, people throw out Singapore, Finland, all of these educational systems. Those are small, wealthy countries with really small populations, and it's easy to manage. India has a problem of scale in that sense, right? But I do think that if you break that problem down into, let's say, 10 problems, there are models that are actually very interesting for those who want to go study it. There are, for example, Costa Rica is a fantastic model, right? They said, hey, we don't really have much of an economy to speak of. So they built among the world's best agricultural universities. And they built that whole system. They don't care if people get degrees or not, and they're actually exported out, right? Rwanda is trying to do the same thing in Africa with IT. What's common in all of these is destigmatizing vocational learning and skill building, and making sure that there is a tight, almost a co-op structure, right? So people learn, go work, come back, learn, go work. It's seen as this virtuous cycle rather than IIT for 4 years and then go get a job.
My last question to Sahil. I'm falling in love with him, actually. Sahil, see, he talked about destigmatization, right? Do you think at some level, because you handle all kinds of students, right, from skilling program to formal degree programs to BTech and all, is it that the structure of polytechnics was bad, or is it that the parents wanted to aspire the children to be BTech and engineers that pushed such massive explosion of engineering colleges, and to that extent we actually, as people have stigmatized the Polytechnic and ITIs?
See, I think, it's very controversial to say, but I think the BTech cycle which came, right, and parents will always want the highest outcome for their kids, right? Wherever the highest salaries are, they'll go for them. Wo BTech se aa rahi thi, then people say, ki, let's my kid do BTech. And I know it is bad to say, but but whenever you have an employment cycle created by the Infosys and the TCS of the world, where we wanted a lot of engineers, we created a lot of BTech institutions. As they slow down, a lot of the BTech institutions are faking flag for not giving employment. But let's look at it from a 20, 30 year, that's fine, that's a cycle. The bad institutions will fold up, or ideally they should be made to fold up. But if you really, really demonize it, that nobody wants to open an institution or something like that, it works the other way.
No, I did work with the regulators. I can tell you how it all works. They can only set up a set of rule sets based on which you can open an institution, but they can't work as a gatekeeper saying, won't allow you in if you follow those things and have the checkbox across the thing. And this is what was argued in the courts also.
If you look at the medical regulator, that has worked even much more poorly, because for a lot of time, medical colleges were not opened in the country, which is why people went abroad.
No,
so
that's
engineering was a much better case study than medical per se. It's a very clear thing that it is much better for a regulator to be
which
relaxed.
is what they did.
But medicine was a disaster.
See, I can say that openly here. NMC is the most corrupt institution in the country ever. So chill. There is nothing that can go wrong if NMC is